Morning, Branson.
Morning, how are you doing?
Doing good, thanks. Hope you are.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. How's the radio station going?
It's going pretty good. I did the community event with the city of Aden yesterday,
Oh,
um,
cool.
and I interviewed all the vendors. So I went back to them and got a card. So I'm gonna do interviews with them. So I've been trying to work out a price list for small businesses and discounts for like people that's in like the Bertie group and the accelerated group so that they can get like advertisement and interviews.
Okay.
So I've been kind of paused because CenturyLink and or Brightspeed, my Brightspeed internet is slow at my office. So luckily I'm getting fiber optic laid in this Wednesday.
Oh, good. At your office, you mean?
Yeah, in the office in Greenville. So that way I'm gonna be able to start doing a lot of stuff. I'm gonna use Talk Shop Live to work on a variety show
Oh, cool.
where I bring on different vendors who have different products, and basically work it out so that I can help them get their products out. And the ones that have a good following, I'll bring them back weekly and give them their own spot and set it up almost like QVC, um, but have it a little more quirky, funny.
Yeah. Have you looked at QVC or Home Shopping Network on their streaming shows?
I've looked at it a little bit, but not a lot.
They've announced about 50 new shows in the last 2 weeks. And all different formats, all different guest hosts. So you might take a look, you might get some ideas from them. I haven't looked through the 50 or so, but it struck me that um, they're really putting resources into it, it must be working.
Yeah,
So, one of the big problems with this live streaming is building an audience, right? You can go live and crickets, right? Nobody's there. So, it just takes time. Uh, I don't know how cross pollination works at Talk Shop Live. I don't know if the fact that they have, all these big names on there, does that mean that, people come by and check Talk Shop Live just generally, even if it isn't a big name? That's the part I just don't know. If you
but
can,
I think with anything, if you generate it and market it, because once I start going, I'm gonna start doing the Facebook ads and different stuff to really push that to the public and to get vendors in. I'm gonna do two different sets of ads. Um, so I think if you, I don't even look at it as Talk Shop Live. I just look at it as like now, like YouTube is just a resource that
yeah,
we get the brand out with. So I'm looking at more of a resource because I'm seeing for over the last couple of months, like I'm seeing that if I do this right, because there's no one here that's really pushing like different brands. Like Mr. Beast pushes his brands, but he's not actually out breaking other brands. So I think I can help break brands. Like yesterday, I met a guy. He had a sea moss strawberry drink,
Uh-huh.
and it tastes like strawberry milk. Like, and he's making this, and they're going to different events selling it. So it's people like that I want to get to the audience that can really, bring a product that people don't usually see.
Uh-huh.
There was ladies out with all types of different stuff that they were giving me that that you can really use in a good a good way.
Yeah.
It just usually can't get seen. They're not seen. So
Oh, yeah. That's a continuing challenge. Hey, Jason, how are you? Eric, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I was a couple minutes late.
No problem at all. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today we're going to go into something called category design, and you may not be familiar with it, but I want to give an example. Hopefully some of you watched the US Open golf tournament yesterday. It's really kind of an example of what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to be stretching it a little bit to try to explain this. But yesterday in the US Open, a person who I would argue almost nobody had ever heard of before, was in the final group with a whole bunch of well-known stars, Rory McIlroy, Scotty Scheffler, et cetera. There was a bunch of really well-known names, and this guy. And I had never heard of him. I'm not as into golf as I used to be, so I haven't been paying that much attention. But this guy to me was completely unknown. I never heard of him, wasn't aware of him in the slightest. But he ended up winning the tournament, and it's a bunch of drama and a bunch of exciting stuff that happened. But it's really a great example of a kind of a creating a new category, right? This guy is not an established star; he's unknown, and yet he held off all these big established stars. And that's the same kind of thing that I think many of us who have small businesses, that we're in a very similar situation. We might be competing against these really giant brands or competitors that are more well-funded than us, but you can in fact cut through. And in this guy's case, what he had to do is he had to play better than these other guys, right? And that's not easy considering how good these other guys were, but he did it, and he ended up creating a new place for himself as one of the upcoming stars in the golf tour. So that's kind of what category design is about. It's trying to, instead of just saying, I'm going to be such and such a product and I'm going to compete against these other products, this is an effort to create a new category. Design a category for your offering, and you will be the only one in that category to begin with. And then others may end up joining your category to compete with you, but in the beginning, you're the only one in the category. So with that, we'll head over there. Okay.
Welcome to Techstars, and today we're going to talk about category design.
When you think about category, it's not just about the message, it's actually about what you do. It's the strategy of your company.
You're a small or young, scrappy company. You don't have billions from your IPO. How can you have an effective strike?
Great question. You name an industry that sounds difficult and established, it doesn't matter. There's new spaces and new opportunities in every single industry that's out there.
If you don't set yourself aside as different, you're just another player in the market, and that's what category design is all about.
Think different. Find what's missing. So I want to walk you through the basic ideas about what category design is all about and how to think that way and how to take your company in that direction if that's something you want to do. So this is basically an overview, but some behind the scenes stuff about the book too. Just want to start out with a few reasons why it's important to think this way. And so one is, everybody in this room probably knows and feels that it's way easier to start a company today than it was 20 years ago. You know, grab a laptop and a credit card, get on AWS, join up with somebody like Techstars. You know, a couple people can have a company up and running in no time that can compete with the giants of the world. But what that means is that if anybody has a really interesting idea in an interesting new space, it quickly looks like this, with 1,000 other companies piling in to do what you're already trying to do. So it becomes really hard to stand out unless you are establish yourselves as some kind of a leader, a thought leader, a category king in a particular space. And another reason to try to go for this idea of category king and category creation is that in any market that's really that's digital, it's a winner-take-all kind of situation. And you can measure that any way you want. In market share, you look at on-demand transportation, and Uber is the obvious category king in this space. It takes 73% of the market share, Lyft 23%. And so market value is another way you could measure it. And Airbnb in particular space worth $30-some billion. When HomeAway was sold, it was worth about $4 billion. Whether you measure it by total usage in the space of online storage, Dropbox kind of identified the category and came to dominate it. And even with all of Google's power and capabilities, it still only has 70% of the usage of this kind of online storage space. And another interesting reason for wanting to be a category king is the category kings tend to attract the best people. And here's a way we know about this. About a year ago, LinkedIn decided to do a study using its data to try to figure out what were the 25 companies that the most talented people in the world want to work for. And when a little background story on this, when LinkedIn wanted to do this study, they ran the data, but they also brought in a woman named Susie Welch to analyze the data and write about it. Now, Susie Welch is a pretty famous business journalist. She used to be the editor of Harvard Business Review. She also happens to be married to Jack Welch, who was the former CEO of General Electric and also kind of a business character in his own right. And so we didn't even really know about this project. And then one of my co-authors, Al Ramadan, got a call one day from Susie Welch saying, we're doing this study, and I happen to have been reading your book. And I noticed that if you map the companies that are landing on that list of the ones people want to work for to the idea of category kings, most of the companies on the list are identifiably category kings. And she wanted to talk to us about the dynamics and why that was. But towards the end of the interview, Al thought he'd ask, he says to Susie, well, how did you end up running across our book? And this was one of my favorite things I ever heard about the book was she said, well, my husband's Jack Welch. And I was like, yeah, I know who Jack Welch is. And she said, well, Jeff Bezos gave your book to my husband and said, you should read this. And then my husband gave it to me and said, you should read this. So that's apparently we're floating around in some pretty high, stratospheric circles there. But the bottom line here is that is also a really good reason to want to identify yourselves as this category king. So I wanted to walk you back a little bit because this is not something that was just based on anecdotal evidence or just our particular instincts. When we started this project, we really wanted to back it up with some real data and background information. I'll walk you through this crazy chart here. We took data from thousands of venture-backed companies and just ran it and asked a whole lot of questions of this data and trying to just see what kind of patterns we could get out of it. And we ran across this one thing that we thought was kind of interesting, but we didn't quite know what it meant, but we'll get to that in a second. But what this ends up showing is that when we looked at the value created by venture-backed companies after they went public, post-IPO value, we noticed this pattern that if companies that went public before they were 6 years old, the trend line basically had them dropping in value from IPO time to after the post-IPO value tend to go negative. Companies that went public between 6 and 10 years old created enormous post-IPO value. And companies that went public after they were 10 years old tended to basically flatline. Didn't really lose value, they didn't really excite anybody either. And we wondered what this meant. We took it to places like Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, the investment bankers there, and we said, we showed them this, and they said, this matches our instincts, this matches what we see. We never ran the data, but actually it's really interesting that, this kind of proves out, but kind of makes sense to us. But they didn't know why this was happening either. So we went searching, and we ran the next step when we asked why this was happening. Oh, by the way, yeah, here's just as a little reminder of that 6 to 10, some of the biggest successes. Facebook went public at 8 years, Amazon at 8 years, Salesforce at 6. Uber in 2018 is 9 years old, so it suggests that if they go public in a year and a half, just don't buy the stock. So we asked, why is this happening? And that led us to the work of an economist named Paul Gawrowski. And Paul Gawrowski studied category life cycles. And he ended up creating this very simple chart that has 2 steps to it, and I'll walk you through each one. So the first step is and this makes intuitive sense if you think about it. When a new category gets identified, and you're down here basically, and one company or 2 companies figure out that there's some new invention, some new cool thing to do, there's hardly any companies in a space. As soon as, think back to that chart with like a zillion companies on it, as soon as it starts to be identified that it's interesting space, zillions of companies jump in, right? You get this spike in the number of companies in the space, and then you get this time period when the number of companies starts to drop off because 1 or 2 kings solidify. They either acquire some of the other companies in the space or the other companies go out of business. And so the number of companies in that category starts to fall into a smaller number. And then over time, it kind of flatlines. It kind of stabilizes at a few companies that are dominating that space. The other half of the curve goes like this, which is when a category is created, obviously it's worth pretty much nothing. And it takes a while for people to get the idea and it starts to have some real value to that category. And then all of a sudden it catches on and it spikes. The total value of that category starts to spike. And over time it matures and levels off. So Gawrowski put these together and created this chart of what a category life cycle looks like. And as you can imagine, the value is still climbing. The number of companies pile in, even though the value is not there. Suddenly the category catches on, king emerges, and it consolidates. But the category is actually taking off now and spiking. And then you get to some place where there's 2 or 3 companies dominating, and the category is pretty much mature and flatlining. And as you can probably tell, when you look at that chart and you say, well, that kind of overlaps to this. And it makes some sense because in this particular phase, the category is very uncertain and who's going to be the king is very uncertain. So you get situations like Groupon going public when it was 3 years old, and you've got a category that looked really promising but ended up not being so promising, and a company that went public at a huge valuation and ended up tanking afterwards. In this particular time period, you end up with 1 or 2 companies emerging that seem like they're going to be the obvious kings of this spiking category, and investors are very excited. That's when you want to put money in a company, and so the value starts to climb because it's got a lot of upside. And then in this last phase over here, what tends to happen is that as the category sort of matures and flatlines and the number of players consolidates, it's all of the excitement is out of it. It's just basically a mature stock at play at that point. So that's why when companies go public when they're late, it doesn't do bad, it doesn't do good. It's just that all of the information is already there, right? You're not really investing in something that's going to spike. So we still, we're asking the question of, but why is that happening? Why do those time frames make sense? And that led us to brain science, of all things. And I had a role in this because this is a book that I wrote, came out in 2011, that was about the intersection of brain science and computer science and how those two fields were learning from each other. And by doing this book, it plugged me into the neuroscience community. And of course, we were big fans of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is all about our brains and how they work and the biases that we have inside of our brains. And so I took the data and the research we had done to a few of my neuroscience friends and said, like, what does this mean to you? Like, how does this map to anything that you understand? And they said, absolutely, it does. And they started talking to us about the cognitive biases in our brains. And cognitive biases are these things in our brains that make us make decisions that are not based on logic. We actually don't make decisions based on facts. We make decisions based on these biases that get embedded in our brains. And there's some 50 of them.
This really ties in with the other stuff that we've been talking about with Simon Sinek about emotion. It's not facts, it's emotion, it's instincts, all kinds of things that go on beyond the facts, like price, availability, et cetera.
Like one is the choice supportive bias, which just means that if you buy a particular product, you tend to think it's the best product because you were so smart because you bought it. It's just out of a flywheel that goes around. And groupthink is what it sounds like. We tend to be influenced by what people think around us. And these biases influence our decisions in a very, very meaningful way. So there's another aspect of things that the neuroscience are talking to us about, and this leads us back to some of the category conversation, that when there's too much choice, when there's a lot of stuff out there, our brains categorize things. And that's why, for instance, when you go in the grocery store, it's not arranged alphabetically. It's arranged by categories, because that's how you think. And you want to go in and you want to find the spaghetti sauce, and you go to the aisle where the spaghetti sauce is, and then you make the choice out of a bunch of things that are on the shelf. Interestingly, in business, a line item on a budget is essentially a category. And that's how, again, we think when we run a company. We need, I know I need some public relations, for my company. And then you think, what's the company that's the most, the dominant one, or the one that, is most important for me to engage in that category. So a winning category strategy actually creates a new line item. If you're a B2B company, creates a new line item on somebody's budget. And so when we create these categories in our minds, and our biases tend to put one or two category kings in that space. When you go to the spaghetti sauce aisle, you probably think there's a spaghetti sauce that you think is the best one or the best value for you to buy, and it's already in your brain. You're not going to go there every time and stare at every one and read the ingredients and look at the prices and decide which one to buy. And here's some just some categories that are we pretty obviously have category kings in, and they establish themselves in our minds as those kings. And so once we have those established as those winners in categories, those biases tend to keep them there. So what that all comes back to is the idea that if you're the CEO of a company, one of your jobs is to actually exploit these brain shortcuts. It's actually to condition our minds and make us have those biases in our brains, and so that you can be seen as this category king and embed people in people's brains. And the back end of this that we got from as we talked to the neuroscience folks is that it takes sustained effort. It's not something that happens with one TV commercial on a Super Bowl. It happens by over and over emphasizing that particular product in that brand and in convincing people that space exists and that you're the king in it. And if you think of a bell curve of the population, you're going to capture some of those early adopters, in those first couple of years. But what happens is that to get to the heart and the meat of the bell curve of what you're trying to influence, actually takes that sustained effort over some 6 to 10 years. And that's why we end up with these kinds of time frames that tend to work for any industry, any consumer products, business to business products. It seems to be, this is how fast the majority of people's minds can move. So as a CEO or a company founder, I mean, basically, what it comes down to is maybe your most important job is to condition people's brains. This is Steve Jobs conditioning our brains. And when he got up on stage, this is classic Steve Jobs, when he got up on stage to introduce the iPad, he literally got up and he said, "We are creating a new category of product." And he said, we have this new age of digital media. We consume this digital media. The phone is too small, the screen's too small to really enjoy, video and things like that. The laptop's too big, it's too clunky, you can't really sit on your couch and lounge and do it. And so we're going to introduce this new category of product that's made for our times. And it's this thing called the tablet, and our product is called the iPad. And he established the idea. We didn't know we even had that problem before Steve Jobs got up on stage and said, you have this problem. And then we all go, oh yeah, actually I do have that problem. I would like to have something like that. And by identifying the category and identifying the problem, he convinced us that he had the solution because he was the only one that was smart enough to figure it out. And we go, yeah, no, I guess I do need an iPad. I'll go out and buy one, $400, great. Importantly, though, the idea is, if you think even of the Steve Jobs example, when you think about category, it's not just about the message. It's actually about what you do. It's the strategy of your company. And it informs everything about your company. And we use this chart. This is in the book. And let me explain. So, as many of you probably know very well, right? When a company starts, it basically starts with product design. It's a couple of people have a good idea. We can build this thing, or we see this opportunity, and you go and you build a product, and that's what you're focused on, creating this cool new thing. And then usually the second thing that happens is, okay, I've got this cool new thing that I've created. Now I need a company to build it, sell it, do all those things that a company does. And you start thinking about what kind of company do I want to have? Where do I want to put it? What kind of people do I want to have in it? What's the logo look like? All those things are designing your company. Now, I would guess that most of you and most people who ever start a company basically stop there. Got a product, we got a company, go. And what we found when we studied all of these companies was that the companies that really succeed and really blow it out have a third thing that they think about, and they think about the space they're going into and how to influence it and how to create it and how to develop that category in people's minds. And by seeing the space, by understanding what the space is and what the problem is they're going to solve, it actually comes back and influences all these other things. Because when you see this very clearly, it helps tell you what kind of product to build. And when you see this space very clearly, it helps tell you what kind of company to build. But also, it's a constant motion because whatever the product you've built and the company you've built help influence what the category is that you're looking at. But all of these pieces need to go together to help you to have a really forward-thinking company strategy. So if you want to do this, how do you start to think this way? The idea of looking for what's missing. And that's, if you're looking at a market and it's already there and you're saying, well, that looks like a big market. This whole idea that has been around for a long time of, oh, that's a big opportunity. There's space for, several winners in that particular space. That's just total bull. It's just not, it's not true in digital markets, because we go back to, in digital markets, winners tend to take all. And so what you want to do is you want to look for a space that's new and that's missing. I mean, this is what Airbnb did when they got started. If you think about the story of Airbnb, these two guys in San Francisco had an apartment, a couple of designers, and there was a conference in town that all the hotels were sold out. And they thought, they didn't have much money. They thought, well, hey, we could blow up a couple of air mattresses, put them on the floor, and serve Captain Crunch in the morning, and put this on Craigslist, and maybe we'll get a couple people that would want to rent this from them. It worked. They quickly realized they thought this, and actually the whole company in the beginning was geared towards the idea of creating space when there were big conferences in town, in any particular town. But they thought realized that there was this missing thing of how do you have these sort of short-term opportunities to rent a place when hotels don't work and you don't want to have a long-term rental on something like HomeAway. And they constantly saw a bigger and bigger missing as they went. But this was a new space that they created. In fact, at one point, I was at this big business conference and sat next to the CEO of Marriott, and I turned to him and I said, well, you guys must really hate Airbnb, don't you? And he surprised me, and he said, no, we don't hate them all. We don't even feel like we compete with them. He said, we hate like Expedia and Travelocity because they take their fees take a portion of our revenue, but these guys, we don't care because they see it as a completely different space. Another way to think is to think different, not just better. If you're entering a space, a market space, with the idea of, well, okay, I see that company is doing this already, and we can go in there and just do it a little bit better, that's a way to have to claw for market share, not a way to really blow it out as a category king. And so thinking about things, you want to be seen as something that's different, not just better. And this has been going on, in history forever in business. And you're laughing. You had one of these? Your family? So this is the Chrysler minivan, right? The little background story on the Chrysler minivan. 1980s, and Chrysler was going bankrupt. This was the time when Japanese cars were on the rise and killing all the U.S. car makers. And Chrysler was suffering the worst. Its back was against the wall. And the leadership at Chrysler, Lee Iacocca was the CEO at the time, was looking at demographic information and realizing that all these baby boomers, the surge in the population, were having all these kids. So there was a big boom in families. And at the time, there were basically two choices if you had a bunch of kids. You could either buy a station wagon, which was just kind of a long car and didn't have as much room as maybe you'd need, or you could buy a regular big old van, which didn't fit in your garage because it was too tall. And so they said, well, can we design a car that's built for, families can hold 4 or 5 kids and fit in the garage and appeal to that particular market? And they came up with this thing called the minivan. Importantly, think about category, right? They created a category of minivan, not a product called the minivan. They created a product called the Plymouth Voyager and the Dodge Caravan, but they established in our minds that you have a family, man, you need a minivan. And then if you need a minivan, then the next thought is, well, who makes the minivan, or who invented this thing? Well, it's Plymouth and Dodge, and those are the people to go to. So this thing basically saved Chrysler in the 1980s. And it saved it by thinking differently from anybody else in the car market. And by the way, category king status is a long-term thing, because you think about the whole thing about biases in our brains. You establish that bias, and it's hard to take away. And it's, what is it, like 40 years later, and Chrysler still owns 50% of the global minivan market. And this was one of my favorites. This is our takeaway from a couple of our favorite Silicon Valley VCs. who said their favorite kind of market is a $0 billion market. And a $0 billion market is a huge opportunity that only you can see. And you have to, and it takes a whole lot of faith and guts, because you have to be able to believe in it, even if others don't. And you have to be able to go in and convince investors and convince customers that that thing actually exists. But if it's a $0 billion market, you don't have anybody else chasing you yet, because you're imagining this thing from the ground up. And so if you're not if you can't look and say, I'm creating a $0 billion market, you're probably on a path you need to think about. Here are a couple of $0 billion markets, by the way. I have a personal story about AWS. I think seem to be constantly circling back to Jeff Bezos, but as a journalist, I had interviewed him many times from the time they were a small company. And I was 2006. I was at a technology conference in San Francisco, wandering around the floor. I get a ring on my cell phone, and it's the PR person from Amazon who says, "Can you come up to suite whatever it was? And Jeff Bezos wants to talk to you." And of course, I said, "Great, I'll be there." And hopped in the elevator, went up, and so I see Bezos, and we sit down, and he says, "I want to tell you about something we're thinking of doing at Amazon." And he describes this whole thing about renting our computing power by the SIP. That was the term he used at the time. And this was a very strange concept. I mean, nobody had done anything like this. And so he's explaining all of this to me, and started stumbling over it for a long time, and he kind of finished, and I looked at him and I said, well, so how are you ever gonna explain this to the public? And he said, "What do you think I called you up here for?" And he seriously was looking for me to write about it in a way that would help him figure out how to talk about it later. But I tell that story in part because he had no idea what AWS was going to become at the time. It was truly a $0 billion market at the time, and he just was throwing it against the wall to try to see if he could create this thing that had never existed before. And similarly, by the way, for this whole 5-hour energy, I mean, it's not just about technology, right? I mean, the guy who started 5-hour energy was wandering around a health food convention. He saw that there were all these energy drinks that were big cans of liquid, and they were being sold in the refrigerator next to Coke and Pepsi and all these other kinds of things. And he goes, well, he's walking around, he's going, well, okay, I'm tired, I need a boost, but I'm not thirsty, I don't want to drink all this stuff. There's got to be a better way. And he created the idea of the energy shot, and in fact, made sure that it was something that was shelf stable so that it didn't have to be sold in a refrigerator next to other drinks. He sold it by the cash register. So it looks like an entirely different category of product. It's not a drink, it's an energy shot. And 5-hour energy now is a $5 billion business. So, $0 billion market, think different, find what's missing.
All right, pretty interesting stuff. Didn't know about 5-hour energy. I thought that was pretty cool. The guy just somehow figured it out. I think they go into some more detail later, but he was at a convention and saw all these people carrying 16-ounce cans of Red Bull or other energy drinks at that time. And he said, I like the energy, but I'm not thirsty. I don't want to drink a giant can of fluid and carry it around with me all day. So that's another thing that came about. I think the story of the minivan also pretty cool, that they just created essentially a new kind of station wagon, the way I see it, that people hadn't thought of before, and to this day, many years later, is still 50% of the market is held by that company, which is really remarkable when you think about all the companies that have come and gone during that time period. Any thoughts anybody want to throw out about what you looked at today? Hi, Waylissa. I don't think I've seen you before. you want to turn your camera on and say hello? Okay, well, for today, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to finish this up tomorrow. I'm also going to touch a little bit tomorrow on some TikTok stuff that I've learned that I'll share with you all, make available, that will help you. I know some of you are interested in TikTok and getting connected with them. So I'm going to make an effort tomorrow to start that process. So unless there's anything else, that's it for today. I hope you have a good Monday, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Dennis.